Good morning. There we are. Good morning. Wow, I say it 6 times and you can't even say it once. Good morning, everyone. There you go. I'm sorry you're sleepy. I can't do anything about that now. My name is Kelly Shushak, and I'm the grateful pastor here at Edges. Thank you for coming to worship with us this morning. While our worship is always an open conversation for everyone, it remains to be seen actually whether today's topic will be for everyone in the room. In order to help us discern that, I've devised a brief 7-question assessment so that you can tell if the conversation we're going to have here today is one you may find helpful. In order to do that, I'd like to employ a tactic that I learned at Kroger from my friend Lisa. So one day I'm at Kroger and I'm in one of those moments when you've just picked up the first thing that has the little tag that says if you buy 5 of these, you're going to get them for $1.99. But if you only buy this one, it's going to cost $16.99. So you're just compelled to make sure you have 5 items so you get the better price. And at that moment, I run into my friend Lisa and I say, I can't talk to you because I got to get 5 items. And if I talk to you, I'm going to miss how many are in my basket. And she says to me, don't you know? You're at Kroger all the time. Surely you know about the finger technique. You don't know. I can tell by looking at you that you don't know. So you put your hands on your basket like this. And when you pick up the first of your 5 items that you're going to get for a better price if you collect 5, you put 1 finger over the bar. And then when you get to the second one, you put your second finger over the bar until you get all the way to all 5 of your items, and then you know how many you have ready to purchase in your basket. This allows you to talk to whoever you want and not have to keep track of the items that are in your Kroger basket. If you learn nothing else today, this will be worth your time spent in worship. So I'd like for you to employ that same tactic here this morning. If you answer yes to one of the questions, you can just quietly put your finger over your bar like this. And then you can put 2. And then throughout the worship, when you're tempted to fall asleep, you can look down and say, ooh, I got 3 fingers up. I better try to wake up. If you don't have any fingers up, feel free to just go on to sleep. It'll be fine. And we'll pick up with you again next week. All right, question number 1. Is this morning in worship the first time this week that you sat down to relax? Or better yet, when Brian sang the song about being still, was it a first time this week that it occurred to you to be still? If your answer is yes, put a finger over your bar. Number 2, does your life always feel out of control? Number 3, is someone in your family running you ragged? Is someone in your family running you ragged? Number 4, do you have one or more high-maintenance friends that you feel the need to save? Do you have one or more high-maintenance friends that you feel the need to save? Some of you are looking around at other people's bars. I see it. Number 5, have you done things lately because you thought nobody else would do them? Have you done things lately because you thought nobody else would do them? Number 6, do you often feel like you'd be fine if there were just a couple more hours in the day? And number 7, do you ever set what you believe are healthy limits and then feel guilty or wrong for doing so? Any yeses? All right. Well, those of us in any of the yes categories could probably use a conversation about what's okay and what's not okay, about how we've drawn our lines, about where in our lives we've put boundaries in place, and whether our perspectives need to be shifted at all. Changing our perspectives. That's the big idea for this week and next week. Today, we'll be talking about boundaries. Many of us either have been or have known someone who struggles with boundaries. And if you didn't answer yes to any of the questions on the unofficial survey, surely the questions reminded you of someone else, and perhaps you could take some of what you learned today to be helpful in that context. It's hard to put good boundaries around all of our relationships with other people, our relationships to things like school or work, our relationships to things like our habits. Further, boundaries are one of the areas where it's really tough to do anything different than we've always done. We're tempted to do what we know, and shifting our perspectives or seeing the same old thing in a new light can be really daunting. Not just hard, sometimes it can even seem wrong. So, I'd like to begin by asking you one question. This is going to be an out loud question, but I want you to try to think of your answer in one sentence or less. Why do you think healthy boundaries are so hard to come by? Don't answer out loud yet. Why do you think healthy boundaries, our relationships with people, with work, with school, with our habits, why is it hard to keep healthy boundaries? Now you can answer. What do you think? I heard feeling guilty 3 times. 3 people said guilt is a reason that it's hard to keep a healthy boundary. So do you mean by that, those of you who said it, feeling guilty when you say no? Okay, or when you say yes? Okay. All right, what else? Kelsey, go ahead. You can always think of an exception to a boundary that you've set. Okay, so it's hard to stay consistent. Okay? People have different expectations of us. Sure. Mark? Fear.
You set a new boundary, you make the world different. Because it's different, it's unknown.
Okay. Fear of the unknown. If you set a new boundary, you've made your world different, and that's always an unknown, and that makes us feel afraid. Sure. What else?
Being replaced or missing an opportunity.
Being replaced or missing an opportunity can be good reasons can be reasons that setting healthy boundaries are difficult. What else? Yeah, other people might not have the same boundaries as you have or that you need to have. Sure. Why are healthy boundaries hard to come by? You might be looking for your worth in the wrong places, and you need to say yes in order or no in order to maintain what you feel like is your worth. Sure. Yeah, it can feel like everybody's watching. Sure. One more. Immediate gratification. Is that what you said? Yeah, immediate gratification can make it difficult for us to set healthy boundaries. Yeah. Some other examples, lots of people have real needs, so it feels like we should stretch our boundaries to meet them. We feel the need to be needed. It's just a human response. Many of us didn't receive healthy boundaries as a part of our development, and so we just repeat what we've always been taught, what we've always known, without question. And some of us have Christian convictions, what we might even call biblical mandates, that seem to suggest any boundary that we might have is unchristian. I can name many quickly. Biblical mandates like turn the other cheek, forgive 70 times 7, consider others better than yourselves, honor your father and mother, love your enemies. These can all be mandates that we feel make it difficult to set any boundary at all. So with these factors in play, it can be really hard to discern what's appropriate and what's not. What's selfish and what's godly. When is it okay to say no to things that are asked of us? When do we need to say yes to things that are asked of us? This is something that many of us in this community struggle with. In fact, this past week I asked a few folks at Edges to talk a little bit about their struggles with boundaries. While their stories, some of which you're about to hear, will be different than your own personal story, You may hear some things that ring true for you or for someone that you care about. What I'd like to share with you now are 3 excerpts, small portions from more complete stories that were given to me this week. Excerpt 1. Most of my boundary struggles have been related to my in-laws. The primary challenge has been related to a family member with a substance abuse problem. For many years, we tried to maintain a relationship and help in all the ways we were asked. Eventually, though, the situation degraded to a point where our belongings were not safe, we were concerned about behaviors around our children, and honestly, we were completely emotionally exhausted. We had to make a very difficult decision to establish some very firm boundaries, and we often wonder whether doing so is not being very Jesus-like to someone we love. What's the right boundary? How do you make a hard call? Excerpt 2. I was told my entire life that I needed to respect my father because that's what the Bible told me to do. Meanwhile, my father was putting me in dangerous, self-satisfying situations that affected me in the moment and much later down the road. I wasn't being loved by him, but I was being called to love him. I wasn't being respected, but God told me I needed to respect him. I still struggle with feeling like my decision to set a boundary makes me selfish or not Christ-like. But I also know that at this moment in my life, not having one would break me. And Excerpt 3. From a self-help standpoint, I know the need for creating a healthy boundary in unhealthy or toxic relationships. I know intellectually that Jesus never intended that being Christ-like means being a doormat. And yet, closing doors on people doesn't seem like a God-inspired dream for us. In my head, a good Christian runs ragged, pouring out everything for anyone and everyone all the time. And a great eulogy that a good Christian should want is, at the end of my life, people could say I had nothing left to give. I poured it all out. But should that be my goal? How do we understand and navigate boundaries? Does following Jesus always mean following the letter of the law? How might our perspectives need to shift? Well, I'd like for us to start by looking at some scripture this morning. It's a passage that maybe some of us have looked at before. I wonder if any of us have ever looked at it up close to a conversation about boundaries. It's a passage that I think invites us to live under the wide and open sky that is God's, while also showing us how to stay safe and healthy with good boundaries. The idea that those two things can coexist. The text we're going to read is part of Paul's letter to the Roman church, and the whole letter is an effort to shift this community's perspectives about how to live as Christians. If you read the whole thing, that's a theme that you can find running through it. But I wonder what would happen if we listened to just part of the 12th chapter, the first 5 verses, in the context of a conversation about boundaries. Let's see what you think as we read it in full the first time. And so, Paul says, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all God has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind God will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship God. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then, only after God shifts the way you think, you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Because of the privilege and authority God has given me, I give each of you this warning. Don't think you are better than you really are. Be honest in your evaluation of yourselves, measuring yourselves by the faith God has given us. Just as our bodies have many parts and each part has a special function, So it is with Christ's body. We are many parts of one body, and we all belong to each other. How might Romans 12 shift our perspective? First, Romans 12 suggests that we need to trust God with our whole messy lives. Do you see the text there? Give your bodies to God because of all God has done for you. If you really think this thought out, this means that God is the only one that gets full access to me. Nothing else and no one else should take up everything I have to give, because that would be idolatry. If I give everything I've got to a boyfriend, I'm not going to give that to a spouse. If you give everything you've got to a boyfriend, a girlfriend, to a boss, to a parent, to a child, if you are all consumed with anything but the worship of God, it's a form of idolatry. So God's the only one who gets access to all of me, to everything I've got to give. And to trust God like that, is to open ourselves to the idea that God might change some of our patterns. That when we say, God, here's my life, help me know what to do with it, some of our patterns might change. There might be a different way that's better than the one we currently know. That's the premise of why we begin at that place. So a question I have for you first is there anything that's taking up all or most of what you have to give? There will just be several moments today where I stop for you to think a silent thought. That's one of them. Is there anything that's taking up all or most of what you have to give? And are you open to changing? If so, then you can give God a shot at you by offering yourself in that way. And then know that God always says yes to your messy life and mine. Do you see the text there? Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind God will find acceptable. What God finds acceptable is whatever your living life is. God's idea is that we offer our lives before we clean them up. Whatever is true is what God finds acceptable. This is what helps us start from an honest place. So the way I think about it is like this. Here's what we're about to walk into, God. I know it's screwed up. I just don't know what to do about it. Help me to know. In a relationship where we have an unequal balance, in a job where we struggle to set a boundary, in a family relationship that we've never been able to make sense, the chances are really good that we've learned some unhealthy patterns that we will keep repeating without some outside help. And this is the way we begin to get it. Question here. To whom or to what are you looking to feel accepted, affirmed, or important? What's telling you that you're accepted, affirmed, and important? God is the only one who will always tell you that. You are accepted, affirmed, and important. Worshiping God like that is the only worship that will hold up. So when we worship a person or a job or a habit, you should just know it's going to go south eventually. When you worship an education, when you worship a relationship, it won't stand up. Because when we worship something or someone that's other than God, that becomes what's most important. And when that's what's most important, we give everything in that direction, and our boundaries go out the window. So part of what Paul is promising here is that we can learn to unworship whatever is not God. We can learn to unworship whatever is not God, which means that every other yes becomes situational. We don't always say yes to what's being asked because why? We have a finite amount to give. And once we understand that, every yes is a situational one. And we only have certain things that are healthy to give. There are some things that are always unhealthy to give. And whenever we give those things, and whenever we give an unhealthy amount, it causes us to worship something else besides God, and that's never God's idea. Question for this section: what do you need to unworship? What do you need to unworship, with a sound effect? Whenever we refuse to worship anything but God, whenever we can really do that, whenever we can say, uh-oh, wow, this has crossed over for me into something that I'm tempted to give everything I've got to. Uh-oh, that means I'm worshiping that thing. Whenever we learn to unworship that and reshift, that will change our perspective. Do you see it there in the text? Whenever we don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. See, we spend a lot of time trying to change the way we behave, when what God wants to change first is the way we think, is to change our perspective, which then shapes our behavior, which takes us out of this kind of legalistic functioning of needing big rules all the time about what's appropriate and what isn't. And this is how we gain clarity. It's what you want, right? In figuring out how to negotiate your relationships with close friends or with family or with coworkers. We want clarity. And this text, Paul says, you will learn to know God's will for you. You can have some clarity as your perspective shifts because you've maintained your right focus. And that will move you in the direction of what's healthy. The text says what's good and pleasing and perfect. You see, it's a chain of events that begins to happen. And here's something to note. Neuroscientists forever have known that our brains are social. That means that human interaction stirs up a biological process within our brains. So when we say no to somebody, when we attempt to establish a boundary and we feel disapproval from that person, it actually hurts. Even mild forms of rejection light up the same parts of our brains where we register physical pain, right? Nobody wants to feel pain. Since it actually feels bad, we often give in and we say yes to avoid an uncomfortable feeling that kind of rejection brings. In doing so, we blur our boundaries. But that is a behavior pattern that God can transform. We don't have to think in that way. So, instead of thinking about that pain in the way we're tempted to think about it, which is to make us say or do something that we don't want or shouldn't do, we can just expect to feel an uncomfortable emotional tinge when we try to establish a boundary and we feel disapproval. But you can learn to trust that as a sign that you're doing a hard but healthy thing. You can learn that sense doesn't always mean what you've learned to think it means. And if you're uncertain about that boundary that you've set because it makes you feel bad, that's where your community comes in. You can check with a person who you trust, who seems to have healthy boundaries, for some discernment. But just because it hurts or feels bad doesn't make it wrong. So Brene Brown talks some about this. Brene Brown is a social anthropologist and researcher who I know many of you have read her books, watched her TED Talks. She says she has a little boundary mantra. And her mantra is, choose discomfort over resentment. And she keeps a ring, I think it's on her right hand, and she says she just twists the ring until she can remember that mantra, which is choose discomfort over resentment. She says in those moments that sometimes it's uncomfortable to say no, or I can't, or I'm sorry, I'm not available, and it feels uncomfortable. But it's so much better for me to choose being uncomfortable in a moment than to feel complete resentment and judgment forever. My friend Sarah said she has a mantra, and her mantra is, my spiritual and emotional health are more important than the absence of tension. I'm willing to endure tension so that I can maintain my spiritual and emotional health. My own mantra, I think I've shared with you before, this crazy habit that I have. I count on my fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in different patterns all the time. So I have a mantra that goes with that, and it's what I feel and what I think matter, what I feel and what I think matter. And I just use it as kind of a calming way. It's because I'm tempted to operate in only what I feel. For example, you know that one of the boundaries I struggle with is writing sermons. And I struggle to create healthy boundaries around that every single week. What I feel every week is that I need to spend more time. I feel like I need to spend more time in the crafting of a sermon. But if I can stop myself and listen to my mantra, which is what I feel and what I think matter, what I feel and what I think matter, I know I feel like I need to spend more time, but what I think is that I've already spent 20 hours this week. When I realize that both those things are true, I feel like I need to spend more time, but what I know is that I've already spent 20 hours this week. Sometimes I'm able to say, and that's enough. And that is enough. And that allows me to set a healthy boundary where I would have just trampled it and pressed forward. And the yes that I would have said to that sermon writing would have meant 20 no's that I didn't mean to say. No's to my family, no's to my own health, no's to my kids. It goes on and on and on. One unhealthy boundary shot always leads to many, many more. So that little mantra helps me to stop. What mantra do you need? That's the question. What mantra do you need to maintain a healthy boundary? What mantra do you need that could help shift your perspective? And when you get to that place where you realize that your perspectives are shifting, where you have some handles, that's the place where you can measure what's the most you can do. Do you see the text? Measuring yourself by the faith God has given us. And notice it's not just about the faith God gives you, it's about the faith God's given to all of us. Sometimes you're creating a boundary allows somebody else to participate in what would be healthy for them. Again, Brene Brown says this, what I've learned is that I don't know whether people are doing the best they can or not. But my life is better when I work from the assumption that they are. And at the same time, that means I have to have really clear boundaries. So instead of judging you and feeling resentful and feeling like you're sucking me dry or you're taking advantage of me, I need to assume that you're doing the best you can. And then I need to set my boundaries and to stop when I've done the best I can do and not get involved to the degree where I lose control over how I understand myself. And we need to realize that when we do the best we can do, it's only part of all God wants to do. And whenever we're doing all of it for anyone, it's too much. Where do you need to recalculate how much you have to give? Or how much somebody else has to give? And finally, we must learn to trust that other people play a huge part as well. Do you see the text? So it is with Christ's body. We are many parts of one body, and we all belong to each other. Now, there's no polite way to say this. When we give in to unhealthy boundaries, it's bad for everybody. When we give in to unhealthy boundaries, it's bad for everyone. When it's with a person, we'll teach a pattern that nobody else who is healthy will step into. So when you create an unhealthy friendship with somebody and they then wonder why they don't have any other friends, it's because no other friends are willing to be as unhealthy as you are. And we've just created that pattern for somebody else to have an expectation that's unrealistic and unhealthy. It's really bad, not just for you, but also for the other person. When we live in the pattern of an unhealthy boundary, we have the capacity to set whole system in place that are warped. When you live with an unhealthy boundary at work, you tempt everybody else to come to that same boundary where you are. When we work too long or too hard because we can't say no, we are in fact saying no to many other things that should have gotten some of our yeses. When we let even one relationship operate without healthy boundaries, we may help normalize an unhealthy pattern of dependence and sacrifice that can literally permeate a whole family or a whole system or even a whole society for years and years and years. Whatever your behavior is, whatever my behavior is, we are teaching it to someone. Question: how has our giving in unhealthy ways reinforced an unhealthy boundary for others? How has our giving in unhealthy ways reinforced an unhealthy boundary for someone else? Because our boundaries, whether they're healthy or whether they're unhealthy, they're not just ours. We make them other people's. Our boundaries are helping others become either more unhealthy or more healthy. But when our boundaries are healthy, they invite us and others to live under God's wide open sky. Now think about that for a moment, that a boundary could bring freedom. What a shift in perspective. So let it be. Amen.